Socks, Chapter 6. Old Tailor. "Don't you like socks any more?" Tiffy asked Mr. Bricker, who was trying to spade a section of the backyard while Socks rolled in the dirt at his feet. The Brickers planned to make a vegetable garden so Charles William could have nice, fresh vegetables to eat. "Sure we like him, Tiffy," said Mr. Bricker. "Then how come he sleeps in the garage?" persisted Tiffy. "We can't have a cat that bites in the house with a baby," Mr. Bricker explained. "He doesn't bite me. He could sleep at my home if he wanted." Tiffy looked wistfully at Socks squirming in the dirt. He would have to spend the rest of the afternoon grooming himself, a small price to pay for a good roll that satisfied all the places he wanted scratched and made his skin tingle. He missed the sort of brushing Mrs. Risley had given him, but the sitter never came again. The young couple could not afford her. Tiffy squatted beside Socks. "Do you want to come live at my house?" she asked. Socks, who had finished rolling in the dirt, sat up and after considering Tiffy a moment, allowed her to pet him. Since he had become an outdoor cat, he was grateful for attention from anyone, even Tiffy, and the two had formed a cautious friendship. "See," said Tiffy to Mr. Bricker, "Socks likes me. He wants to live at my house." She made the mistake of patting his head, and Socks moved away. Petting and patting were not the same. He was disappointed in her. "A cat's heart is where his dish is," said Mr. Bricker. Mr. Bricker was wrong. Socks' dish and water bowl had been moved to the back step, and his bed had been moved to the garage, where a window was left open so he could come and go. Still, his heart remained in the house with his family. Loneliness and curiosity drove Socks to spend more and more time sitting on the windowsill watching all that went on inside. He watched Mr. Bricker's shadow box in front of the playpen and listened to Charles William laugh. He watched Charles William grab Brown Bear by one leg and beat him against the playpen pad, and he heard him shout, "I did." He was curious for a closer look at the plastic ball filled with water and sloshing plastic fish. He saw Charles William support himself on his hands and knees and crawl across the pen. He watched him grab the bars and pull himself unsteadily to his feet. "See the kitty?" said Mrs. Bricker many times a day as she looked up from her typewriter. "The kitty is looking at you." Charles William paused in throwing his toys outside his playpen or pounding on a pie tin to stare at Socks. Sometimes he watched Socks without his mother telling him to. Loneliness was not the only trouble in Socks's new life. Jays scattered his dry food and swooped at him whenever they came to steal. He felt threatened on Tuesday mornings when the garbage men came, and he was afraid of the milkman. But his biggest worry was Old Tailor, the black cat with the torn ear and the bulging jowls, who lived across the back fence and belonged to a family named Taylor. Although the fence was the property of the house rented by the Brickers, and should have been part of Socks's territory, Old Tailor made it his own by sleeping on it whenever the sun was out. This habit annoyed Socks, who sometimes wanted to sit on the fence out of Tiffy's reach when he grew bored with her attention. However, the two cats had come to an understanding. Old Tailor would beat up Socks if Socks tried to sit on the fence while Old Tailor was using it. One morning Socks, who had fallen asleep on the warm hood of an old station wagon, was awakened by the sound of a late spring rain driving against the garage. The car hood had grown cold and hard, and after a bow, a stretch, and a brief wash, Socks sprang to the windowsill where he saw that the neighborhood was still dark. There was no hope of breakfast, but he might find dry food left in his dish from the night before. The grass was cold and wet on his paws as he ran through the downpour in the direction for the back step. In the dim light, Socks saw a sinister black shape crouched at his dish in the dry spot below the eaves. Old Tailor! Though through the sound of the rainwater gurgling in the drainpipe, Socks heard the crunch of teeth crushing dry cat food. This intrusion would not do at all. Old Tailor had his side of the fence, and Socks had his. Socks would not quibble about the fence itself, but his food was a different matter. He crouched, flattened his ears, and hissed, hoping to frighten the other cat, but prepared to defend his dish if he must. Old Tailor merely glanced in his direction and went on gnashing and crunching. Socks's honor as a cat could not excuse such rudeness. He advanced, still hissing, through the rain. Old Taylor stopped gnawing and grinding. He flattened his ears and hissed back from the dry spot on the step. By now, Socks was not only angry, he was soaking wet. He ignored the rain and continued to crouch, changing his hiss to a light sing-song wail intended to warn Old Taylor that he meant what he said. His tune did not frighten Old Taylor. The black cat returned the sound louder and meaner. No young upstart was going to tell him anything. The fur on the two cats rose along their spines. They wailed and howled and caterwauled, and all during the eerie duet they were moving closer to one another with their fangs bared and their ears laid back. Nose to nose, Socks found Old Taylor a terrifying sight with his ear torn and his fur standing out on his great black jowls. But Socks did not back down. Finally, with a terrible scream, the cats were on one another, a growling, snarling, yowling tangle. They crawled and bit and tumbled down the steps into a puddle. They rolled across the soaking grass and into the freshly spaded earth. They floundered and wallowed in the mud. Old Taylor was on his back, thrashing at Socks with punishing blows of his strong hind feet. Socks felt claws and teeth through his fur. He hurt, he was bleeding, and Old Taylor had sprayed him. The black cat was too much for him. Socks no longer cared about his dry food. He let the old tomcat have it. Socks wanted to get away, to untangle himself from the snarling, biting mass of muddy black fur. Somehow he did get away and ran for the garage while Old Taylor sent sing-song warnings after him through the downpour. When Socks tried to leap to the windowsill, the weight of the mud on his fur made him fall. When he tried to lick his bleeding forepaw, the rasps on his tongue scraped up a mouthful of mud. Cold, wet, stiff with mud, and in pain, Socks needed help. Lights were coming on in the bedrooms, bathrooms, and kitchens of the neighborhood. Old Taylor had disappeared. Slowly and painfully, Socks made his way through the rain, through the scattered cat food, now soggy and unappetizing, to his own back door where he cried a small, desperate mew for help. Mrs. Bricker, who was in the kitchen, heard and must have understood, for she immediately opened the back door. "Socks!" she cried, shocked. Socks looked up at her with sad, defeated eyes. "Oh, poor Socks!" Mrs. Bricker opened the door wider, and Socks stepped painfully into the laundry. "Bill, come and look at Socks. He's been in a fight." Mr. Bricker came down the hall with his bathrobe flying. "Why, you poor old fellow," he said when he saw his cat. Socks waited helplessly. "And he's bleeding!" cried Mrs. Bricker. "What will we do? He can't lick all that mud." Mr. Bricker agreed. "And if we tried to give him a bath, he'd climb the wall." "We can't let the mud dry," said Mrs. Bricker. "Adobe bricks are made out of mud like this. If it dries, he'll turn into an adobe cat." "Try wet bath towels, Mr. Bricker." Mr. Bricker snatched a clean towel from the tangle on top of the dryer and dampened it under the kitchen faucet. Mrs. Bricker did the same. They knelt and began to rub Socks. How good the warm towels and gentle hands felt. Charles William awoke and fussed in his crib, but this time Socks got the attention, which made him feel better. "Poor Socks," grieved Mrs. Bricker as she swabbed with a second towel and then a third. "It's all our fault for shutting you out." She dropped the towel into the washing machine and reached for a clean diaper. "Socks should learn to roll over on his back and kick with his hind feet when he gets in a fight," said Mr. Bricker, who was interested in all sports. "His strength is in his hind legs. He should hang on with his front paws and give Old Taylor everything he's got with his hind legs." "Bill, you can't coach a cat." Mrs. Bricker laughed affectionately as she held another diaper under the kitchen faucet. Charles William increased the volume of his fussing and began to rock his crib. "Socks needs us," his mother called to him. "You'll have to wait." Then she said to her husband, "Bill, can't we let Socks live in the house again? I know he didn't mean to bite so hard that time, and I always watch him when he's in the room with Charles William." "I don't see why not," said Mr. Bricker, scrubbing the matted fur with a clean diaper. "He's older and wiser now, but we'll still have to keep an eye on him." Charles William began to bump his crib against the wall. I'm coming! Mrs. Bricker rinsed her hands in the kitchen and, without bothering to change him, carried Charles William to his high chair, which she she turned so that he could watch from the kitchen. She handed him a spoon to bang and went back to swabbing Socks. Charles William enthusiastically whacked the spoon on the tray of his high chair until Socks caught his interest. He stopped whacking to stare. He'd never seen a mud-covered cat before, and he had to give the matter some thought. "Ticky," he said at last. "Ticky?" Socks understood that Charles William was talking to him, and beneath his misery he felt the beginning of a new interest in the baby. Both parents stopped scrubbing the cat to look at their son, then at one another. "Did you hear that?" cried the mother. "He's talking. He's trying to say kitty." "Smart boy," said the proud father. Socks was forgotten. Charles William had spoken a word. Well, almost. Ticky. Imagine that. Charles William had called Socks Ticky. His mother would write his first word in his baby book. His father would write the news to Nana. Maybe even phone collect. Charles William, overwhelmed with his new cleverness, heaved the spoon across the kitchen. Then the Brickers noticed the clock. If they did not hurry, Mr. Bricker would be late for class. He rushed off to dress while Mrs. Bricker dashed about the kitchen trying to prepare one breakfast for the parents and another for the baby. "Ticky," said Charles, pleased with himself and eager to rekindle the excitement that he had caused. "That's right," answered his proud mother. "We can't forget Ticky." She returned to the laundry where Socks was licking his wound and offered him a piece of meat with her fingers. He was sorry that he had no appetite. Mrs. Bricker turned on the clothes dryer to warm the laundry and closed the door. This time Socks did not object to being shut in. He crouched on aching joints and, allowing for the weight of the mud on his fur, leaped onto the top of the dryer where he settled himself to lick his bleeding leg in the tangle of clean diapers waiting to be folded. In the kitchen, Charles William demanded admiration. "Ticky," he said, slapping his palms on the tray of his chair. "Ticky!" "Kitty," said Mrs. Bricker. "Ticky," said Charles William, and laughed. He had invented a game. Socks was soothed by the hum of the dryer and by the heat rising through the diapers. His throat began to vibrate with a hoarse and rusty-sounding purr, as if he had not purred for a long time. "Kitty! Ticky!" Mrs. Bricker and the baby were talking about him.